Gentleman from Fairfax, Mr. Albo.
Mr. Speaker, members of the House, to get you up to speed, this is a bill we talked about yesterday. As I was explaining yesterday, when the Commonwealth Transportation Board decides to distribute money for highway maintenance, which is highways, bridges, tunnels, they don't have a formula. They do it on an as-needed basis. What I was trying to do is to get them to use some type of objective scientific measurement. A number of years ago, the Virginia General Assembly passed a law requiring the CTB and VDOT to develop asset performance standards, which are scientific standards on the quality that establish the quality of pavement, bridges, and tunnels. And what this bill does is doesn't mandate that they distribute the money based upon that. It says that when they produce their report on how they distribute the money, they should show us what it would look like if highway maintenance was distributed purely according to these scientific standards. The question that the gentleman from Salem asked was, what are these standards? How do you look at these standards? How does a scientist or an engineer decide what the quality of a highway or road is? And we delayed it till today so we could find the answer. Fortunately, I know a gentleman from Fairfax who builds roads and stuff, and he's an engineer, and I'd like to yield to Delegate Rust, who could answer that question in detail.
Gentleman from Fairfax, Mr. Rust.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The question was, what was asset management? Asset management is defined in the code 33.123.02, and I'll read that as a systematic process of operating and maintenance of the state system of highways by combining engineering practice and analysis with sound business practices and economic theory to achieve cost-effective outcomes. There are three goals of asset management: life cycle analysis, needs-based budgeting prioritization for maintenance and operation, and a process. It defines a process to plan budget implementation, monitoring, and measuring of the performance. It follows, this is not new ground, though I will tell you VDOT is on the cutting edge of this. They have outlined their program based on the AASHTO, which stands for American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials. They put out a document in 2002, which is about 100 pages long, but it outlines how you go about doing this. It is a huge data gathering and data processing program. Just to sort of give you a little bit of how they do it, pavement data is collected on an annual basis on both the interstate and the primary system. The secondary system, because it's so big, is collected every 5 years, or about 20% per year. Bridges and large culverts are looked at on an annual basis. Also, on a random basis, they look at what we call the appurtenances of the highway system, and that's the guardrails, the signs, the traffic signals, the pipes, the ditches, and all the other things that make our transportation system work. Now, how do they do it, which I think is the real question? They do it by a combination of physically going into the field and looking at these structures. There are bridge certified individuals who go out and look at the bridges, perform various manual tests on the bridges to determine the stability of them, the structural capabilities of them. It's a visual inspection. They actually, if you ever watch any of them do it, they pound on the bridges with hammers, and they're able to tell by the tone of the hammer whether the steel inside is good and so forth. On pavements, it's basically a visual inspection. There's also very sophisticated equipment that they pull behind vehicles, which can measure the roughness, can measure the ground-penetrating radar, can measure the thickness of it. You also can obviously look at the core samples. But all of this is then entered into a pretty significant computer program, and at the end of it, it comes out with a rating system of all the appurtenances in the highway system. Delegate Albo, I hope that answers the question. And later on, when I have a bill with a lot of legal questions, I will turn to you for assistance. If there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them, Mr. Speaker.
Jim.
that study was to look at the 10 highway districts and to look at the percentage of pavement and bridges that were below standard. And that's the language that you see before you. It says, release to the public the information on how the allocation would be, not on lane miles, not on vehicle miles traveled, but the performance standards of specific asset performance as to what percentage of the highway and bridge surfaces are below standard. And as it has just been presented to me, what you would find in that study is that it is the Northern Virginia district that by far has a much higher percentage below standard. So again, hosing's in the eye of the beholder. It's been decades when the allocation of maintenance has just been basically either, as I tried to understand it in my own district at one point, they said to me, and I don't know if this was exactly true or not, well, everybody gets the same amount. Every maintenance office gets the same amount. I doubt that that's true, and by every office, I mean I represent 4 different maintenance areas. Even within those 4 areas on a given year, there are different needs, and yet everybody got the same $1 million for maintenance. The value of what this body did several years ago was to work with VDOT, say, let us know how you're doing. It's all part of this whole audit trail. We want to know what the conditions are of our bridges and roads, and this is all that this bill represents. As you make allocations, let's look at allocations based on the substandard infrastructure as well as how the money is being allocated. Again, politics is in the eye of the beholder, and our formula for primary roads, for example, has always had a 10% needs factor because we have known that there are areas of the state where you have to make an investment in an immediate problem. And that's the kind of decision that the Commonwealth Transportation Board makes. But on a year-in, year-out basis, it ought to be based on standards of performance. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen of the House, I want to go ahead and kind of back up in terms of what this bill does. And if we really were able to go ahead and start from scratch in terms of highway maintenance and maintenance funding distribution, what would be the fairest way to go ahead and do that? And for a long time, we've seen bills and we've grappled with how to make that happen. And I'd argue that the best way to do that wouldn't be to take a look at lane miles. It wouldn't be to go ahead and take a look at population. These are all artificial indicators. You'd go back, you'd go ahead and assess your need, you'd set performance standards, and you'd look at minimum standards and levels of service. In 2007, this General Assembly did something very, very wise. We went ahead and asked VDOT to go ahead and do that, and they produced that tool for us. It's a very, very powerful tool. It is a tool that really steps back and says, here is what we need to do to make sure that all members of our Commonwealth have a level playing field and a level amount of service for their roads. The only thing that is missing in all of this, quite frankly, is that we are not using that tool to go ahead and guide our decision-making process. If we're not going to use it, why on earth do we go ahead and spend the money to go ahead and have it? I would go ahead and I want to go ahead and draw people's attention there to line 18 and 19, because I think there was a misstatement by some folks that I have a deep respect for in terms of what this would go ahead and do. And it doesn't go ahead and allocate money consistently across our transportation districts to go ahead and make the matter worse. I think you need to go ahead and read it, and what it says is that we're going to go ahead and make sure there's a minimum level of disparity among highway construction districts in meeting asset performance standards. And that's a very important distinction. And so if you have one area of the Commonwealth that is doing pretty good and meeting its performance standards, and you have another area that is not meeting those performance standards, that is not fair. And that's what this language does, is to make sure that we all have an equal level of service for all of our tax-paying members of the Commonwealth. And I hope it's the pleasure of this body to pass the bill.